Hey, this is Max. Welcome back to another CSR2 video. I am here tonight to talk about launching a car. Now, this seems like something very simplistic in this game and something everybody should know how to do. But let's be honest, how to launch a car and properly launching a car could be more difficult than it looks. And let's talk about some of the ways it can be done. One of the cars that you absolutely need to launch perfectly in is the Mazda Miata, which is the Tier 1 challenge for Tempest 3. The thing is, when this car is fully maxed, if you don't launch it exactly perfect and use nitrous in third, you're going to lose against the boss and lose out on that particular prize. So the Mazda is where I see people really struggle with the launch techniques. So how many different ways do people do launching of T1 cars? Well, there are generally two. One way is the tap method. You try to get it just right there, and that will allow you to get a perfect launch and great run. The tap method relies on a little bit of timing. You want the needle to kind of fall in or fall back exactly to perfect as you see the countdown about to finish. That 12.153 run with the fully maxed Miata will allow you to win the boss car. So that's one way to do it. Of course, that's a tricky way to do it because that needle moves a lot, and if you don't get it just right, you could lose very easily. Another technique that I see people use, and I personally use in most of the way I run my cars, is basically a gas release needle drop method. So what happens is you know that the needle moves at a certain speed from here to here. And then you kind of try to time it based on the countdown as to when you release gas. So you hold down gas and you try to release it just fast enough to get it. I was a little late there. That's going to cost me the run. So this is where that boss run with the Miata really requires a little bit of practice before you go take them on. Because if you don't do it just right and you're too far off of perfect, you could lose. That actually won't cut it. The boss runs like a 12.20 something, so I would have lost that run. So I let go a little too late, but when you're practicing, this is one way where you can get the timing down with the release method, is you just adjust your timing slightly. So let's try it again, and I'll try to adjust the timing, and there's the perfect. So with the perfect, once again, you're now guaranteed to get the time you need to win. This is particularly important both for the boss runs and also for certain type of challenges like Showdown. But Showdown introduces a completely additional step to the launching technique, which is the launch button. So we're going to talk about it with a different car. Understand that Tier 1, no matter it's live racing or map racing, you don't get the launch button. So the only techniques you need to know about launching are those that I just showed you, either the needle drop or the tap, 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 trying to keep the needle where the green spot is, and then just watch the needle count down. But once you introduce an additional factor of actually having to deal with the different launch points with a launch button, things will get more interesting. But before we even get to that, there are other cars that have a different launch point. And again, people will look at it and go, well, that launch point pretty far back. Why wouldn't you use the tap tap method? Can you still use the needle drop? And the short answer to that is yes, you can still use the needle drop. Doesn't matter where the launch point is. So we're going to look at the Regera, which also has a funky launch point. It's a little bit further back, right? It launches at about 4K. So naturally, you have to time your release a little differently. You actually have to release on 2, and it'll land right on that spot right there. And as you can see with the Stage 6 Trans, this car does some pretty funny launching. So right there, we got it through. Now, this is without a launch button. Now, let's talk about launch button use. with different cars, launch button comes into play only after you get to tier 2 and up, and it is used extensively both in live racing and also all showdowns, except for the one time where they said no launch button for whatever reason. So basically, showdown and live, if you're going to get into those kind of racing and you're going beyond tier 1, you now have to learn the launch button. Before recent updates in the last year or so, the testing area did not have the option to use the manual launch. You now have the option to use manual launch by turning it on here, so you can actually practice the launch button. But we're not going to do the launch button with the Regera yet. I want to go back to a different car first to show the launch button used a little differently. So let's take a look at the LB Aventador. Now, this is a car that I use the launch button on, and I use in live racing quite extensively. The thing about having a launch button versus not having a launch button is this. The launch button essentially takes over and is used to dictate your actual point where you're telling the computer, I'm ready to go. So the main trick to the launch button is you want to make sure you hit it as close to the time that you want to perfectly launch as possible. So if you're using this method, you would want to watch the numbers and launch accordingly. Now, obviously I didn't launch them perfect, and I get that weird wheel spin with this car, and that's natural with this car. But you got one more factor now to consider. So using the tap method of launching takes a lot of practice to efficiently do it. Because not only are you tapping to keep the needle where it is, you're watching the countdown, and you're trying to tap the launch button right before the countdown finishes. So you have like 3 things you're trying to do. Okay, and if you don't do it right, you don't get a perfect launch. Now, with this car particularly, even if you get a perfect launch, you're screwed because it does a wheel spin when you get a perfect launch. So what you're actually going to try to do is do a late launch. That is actually easier for the tap method because since you just tap it somewhere beyond perfect and then hit the launch button. Now, one of the methods I want to introduce to you, which is the way I launch cars, and I think it's one of the easiest way to launch, is to simply use the launch button to do everything. Meaning the only button you're going to watch for is that. You're not going to release gas. You're just going to hold it down. And you're going to time it so that you will launch almost like the needle drop method. Okay. So you're going to time how long it takes for the needle to get to here. And you're going to launch earlier by that same amount of time on the launch button. Sounds complicated? All right, let's do it, and then we'll better understand what I'm talking about. So if I want to launch as perfectly as possible, I will launch right there. Notice it landed right near where perfect is, even though it says wheel spin launch. That's part of the way this car works. You do get the needle to immediately drop to where it should be. This is the same timing as if I was running without the manual launch. I always tell people you hit the launch button when you would normally let go of the needle. Meaning if you were using the needle drop method I showed before, like this, you would let go of the needle now to try to get a perfect, right? By letting go, you're letting the needle drop to that point. When you're using the launch button, you don't have to do that. All you have to do is hit the launch button at the same time that you would normally let go. So we let go of the needle at 1, right? The countdown went to 1. I let go of the needle. This time I'm not going to let go of anything. I'm just going to hold the gas down, and I'm going to hit the launch button at that same moment that I would have released the gas. So instead of releasing the gas, I wait till 1, hit the button. Boom. The needle gets dropped for you automatically. You do not need to adjust for it. However, that is harder when you are driving certain cars. Let's take a look at a car with a different launch point. With the Regera, for example, because the launching is so far back, When you're using the launch button, you cannot get away with launching it at 2 when you would have normally let go. The computer just doesn't compensate for it. For example, let's try it that way. So I'm going to wait till 2 where I would normally let go and hit the button. That messes it all up. It's a good launch, but it's totally messed up. It didn't work. With cars like this, where there's so much time difference between when you can hit the launch button and when the needle will get to the launch point, you have to use a third method, and that is to release and then hit the launch. Sounds complicated? A little bit, but it's not too bad. So the difference now is you're still going to release the needle at 2 like you normally would, okay, like this, and then you hit the launch button as the needle about to land onto perfect. Now, you also have to time it so that you don't hit the launch button too late, because if your reaction time goes into the positives, it starts to hurt performance. This is kind of weird and really doesn't make sense that the game doesn't punish you for negative reactions, but it does sort of punish you for positive reactions. So if you're late, you're late. But if you're early, you're okay. That's kind of doesn't make sense, but that's how it works. So what happens is you're always going to do a slightly negative launch with most of the techniques that I'm showing, but a perfect launch obviously is still good for you, but a positive launch on reaction is almost always bad for you. So that is both dropping the needle as well as hitting the timing. That is the most difficult, I think, of the cars to time perfectly. I like mostly to use cars that I can simply time the needle according to the time and just tap the launch button, because I don't have to then stress about messing up. And that's kind of an important aspect of launching the car. There's another car I'm going to show you that has kind of a late launch point. Let me see. This guy. So this one, the launch point is even closer to red line. So you can still use the launch button technique of timing just the button, but again, it's a little harder because, oops, okay, let's do it first without the button because it is a different point, but it's a little bit harder because it's so close to red line, so the timing's harder. So this is right here rather than over here. You really have to wait till near the end of 1 to let go, and even then it's early. So you're waiting almost to go to let go of the needle. That means your timing the launch button is going to be a little more difficult as well. So depending on exactly where the launch point starts, different techniques might be the most optimal. For example, if the car has a pretty big spot for perfect launch, it's in a weird spot, and the needle doesn't move rapidly too much, you're almost better off doing the tap method. With a lot of T1 cars, that works really good. Usually with T5, T4 cars, not so good. But now that we're going to do one with the launch button. Now, obviously, with the launch button, you want to hit the button when the time comes, right? So it's going to be the same thing, but it's going to be pretty late. So if you go too late, though, you're going to get a really bad launch too. So you kind of have to time it. Now, this one, what happens is, even if I had the needle to drop to the right spot, for some reason, the computer won't register it as a perfect launch. That's because it's probably slightly off from perfect, so it's not registering it as a perfect launch. You could get a perfect launch, however, again with the same button technique, but with a last second release, meaning you're going to let go of the needle and hit the launch almost at the same time, really late. So that could also work. Okay, that's a little bit more of a good launch. I let go a little early, but that one is a kind of a trick technique to time it just right. So there again, you have to adjust to how you are used to launching and do it that way. Every person have their own favorite method that they basically swear by. So there's no really wrong way to do it, but these are the most key ways that I've seen done. But a lot of advanced players that are trying to get very consistent times, particularly in competition like Showdown, tend to use the needle drop with a negative launch like this, because you'll almost always be able to time it to the countdown and get it very consistently to the same time. Now, there are another problem that people often run into with any kind of launch technique, and that is the 0 RPM drop. The 0 RPM drop happens a lot because cars are tuned too far to the negative side of grip, and it causes a needle drop when you launch it. Then you have cars like this, which you just cannot perfect launch, so you have to learn to not launch it perfectly. Let's take a look at a car that does 0 RPM drop as I have set it up. So the 0 RPM drop issue, very hard to deal with when you're using either the needle drop or the tap method, and you're trying to get it dead on perfect, because you're gonna fail. Most of the time, randomly, it's gonna hit 0 RPM. Now in showdown, if you're using this technique and you're trying to get it just right, you get that, and it's really frustrating. So the beauty of using the launch button technique is you can compensate for it by being slightly off on timing, which is a great thing. So now you can launch it either early or slightly late, knowing full well that a perfect launch is going to hurt you. You can compensate it by timing. And you're not really doing a whole lot. You're just holding the button down and hitting the button either slightly early or slightly late. So what you're really having the needle do is when you hit the button here, you're having the needle drop to here or here rather than here. So you don't get the 0 RPM. All right, let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to launch a little bit early, like that. Now I went to 4K, but what it does is it lets me run the car without any problems, and it still gets a decent run in. Now, if you want to get it much closer, you can. And usually the better way when it's closer is to run it on a slightly late launch. So again, timing is the key. You just kind of have to figure it out. You don't want perfect, but you don't want too far off of perfect. So if let's say we want it slightly late, I could do it like this. That's late, 6,000. Same thing, the car will launch and no 0 RPM drop. You can get it much closer to that than you think. Different cars are different. Again, I'll show you with the Bach Mono that you can get it very close without getting the 0 RPM drop, or you can get the 0 RPM drop if you go a little bit early or a little bit late. So each car, depending on how far it's tuned to have the variance, can be very different in where the 0 RPM drop occurs. The closer the car to a perfect tune, the more likely that it will only have a 0 RPM drop at a very specific point. But again, having the ability to tweak your launch point just a little bit is very important to, and consistently do it is very important to avoiding certain issues with 0 RPM. Now this one is a one launch, okay? Whoops, I guess I was too late at one launch. Let me do that again. I'm pretty sure I didn't. Yeah, I forgot to. Duh. I didn't turn this on. Okay. Let's do that again. So I should have let go of the needle at 1. Instead, I just tried to hit launch button that didn't exist. All right. Here we go. Hold. All right. 3, 2, 1. Hit the button. That's an early launch. No problem there. Now, if I do a late launch, I can do that as well. And then I'm going to do a perfect launch, and you'll see the needle drop. Okay. That's a negative 4.5 launch, so it's very negative. Let's do one that's closer to perfect. Okay, here we go. That's closer to perfect on the late side. So again, no problem. You can launch it and get right through here, no problem. So perfect would have been somewhere in between that, right? It would have been right on 1 as it turns into 1 with before it does. So what you're really doing is you're breaking down the countdown of that 1 into segments and you're trying to time it to a particular segment, that would put it right at the 5. And that's, again, a little bit early. So it takes a little bit of work to get the hang of it. I've always launched this car early or late so much that it's hard for me to adjust right now. But I'll show you the RPM drop by using it with the needle drop method without the launch button. Right there, boom. If you get it perfect, you get a 0 RPM drop. Now the timing is actually right between 2 and 1. So when 2 flashes to 1 right there, I let go, it'll hit that spot. The same would still work with the launch button, but fortunately for me, I actually don't want to get that. So my launches are usually slightly early, slightly late, which gives me still the runs I want without the headaches of 0 RPM launch. So there's no best technique. It's really a car dependent technique. When I was talking earlier about the tap method, for example, in tier 1, cars like the GTI and the Civic, or even the Abarth, which is one of my favorites. Let me see if I have that around here somewhere. I know I have an Abarth in every account. It's just I don't have it where I need it to be. All right, not a big deal. Let me show it to you with GTI, which will still demonstrate the same thing. So with some slower T1s, because the needle moves so slow, the tap method is the easiest. And, well, not the easiest, but it's one of the easier techniques to use. And that's one technique I see a lot of people kind of get used to in T1 and then can't really get over when they move beyond T1. So here's the tap method in T1. You just do this. Because the needle moves so slow, you almost can't screw it up. So that's perfect launch, perfect shift, right? That is the base technique I see, again, the most newer players tend to start off using because the other techniques don't come to you naturally. This is why I'm showing you the other ways so you can get a feel for different ways to do it. So that one doesn't, again, manual launch doesn't exist for T1. So as you can see, I mean, I could put it on. Well, this is interesting. I'm not sure how this would work for this car. A launch button for T1 would be interesting. Hey, launch button. How about that? All right. So you can actually get launch button with the T1 in practice, which is fun. But in reality is that, of course, it doesn't exist in live or in any kind of racing. But at least you can practice. I guess the good news is you could use a easier to launch car like a T1 to maybe practice the launch button patterns until you kind of get the hang of the concept first. All right, so summarizing back to the discussion here. So there are essentially, in my opinion, 3 main techniques of launching the car with the launch button and 2 main techniques without the launch button. Without the launch button, you're basically doing either a tap, tap, tap or a needle release method, both of which are very effective and would accomplish the job. Once you get to higher tier in live and in showdown, things change a lot. This is where the techniques that you develop will make a really big difference in how well you do in live racing. For example, I know for a fact that I always want to launch late with the LB Aventador. You never want to launch perfect. So the way I do it always is hold the needle down and watch for the red flash on the 1 and let go. That almost always puts me at 7,000 RPMs. And that allows me to always get a non-spinning start where you're just grinding the gears and the wheels are just free spinning without moving the car forward. This is the best way for me to do what I need to do, especially when you're trying to run under dyno. So that's kind of that technique. The main advantage of the technique I use with what they call essentially a negative launch technique is you're launching the car negative timing because it's when you would have normally let go of the needle. And by doing so, you're ignoring letting go of gas pedal altogether and you're focusing completely on timing the tap of the launch button. And it can be very consistent in that you can constantly repeat the exact same launch over and over and over. And this is the recommended technique from me for you to try to practice and learn, because it is so much easier than managing 3 or 4 different things at the same time, tapping the gas, watching the countdown, and trying to time the launch button all at the same time. Just seems a little too complicated. It's much easier to just simply time one button to the countdown without worrying about anything else. None of this to say that if something works for you, if a technique works for you, there's no reason for you not to use it. So launch techniques, depending on the car you have, takes a little practice. And the good news is you can now go into tuning and do the practice, but it takes a little practice to get the hang of it. Once you get it and you can do it consistently over time, you'll find that one technique may work better than another for you. Some people always want to let go of the needle before they hit the launch button, simply because to them the timing is easier, because they don't have to count through the countdown to hit the button. They just hit the button at the very end. They just watch the needle get to right where perfect is, and then they hit the launch button, and they feel more comfortable that way. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not the technique that I use. I tend to use the technique where I just don't have to worry about the gas pedal at all. I hold it down, I hit the launch button, the needle drops by itself, and then the gas pedal disappears anyway, and you can now start shifting. Not always the easiest. For example, again, just to recap, you can't do it so much with any car that launches at, a very early point because of the way the starting point is located. Also difficult to use sometimes on cars that launch very late, like the Ford GT here, where literally the launch point is right dead on near the red line. So these two are the ones that you have to adapt a combination of techniques for. Generally, you're either not doing the and this car always gets a 0 RPM drop too because the way I have it set up. So when you have it that way, it doesn't really make that much of a difference at that point. You can tap the gas, hold the gas. You're just trying to launch it at red line, which is a lot tougher. All right. If you have any questions about launching the car in the game or the way the launch button works, and I know that despite all my explanations, it could still be something that's confusing to you, you can feel free to ask me. I can always do follow-up videos to try to better explain it. And I'm going to explain things again in writing within the video as you saw. So if any of this still isn't sinking in, do ask me in the comments, and I'll try to explain in other ways to help you understand it. If you think that you have a fourth technique, fifth technique that works that I didn't demonstrate here, feel free to let me know. Let other viewers know so that they may be able to pick up another way to launch the car that is consistent for them. In the end, as I said before, there's no wrong way. There are no wrong way to do it. You want to do the technique that works the best for you. Well, I hope this video was of use to you and that something in here was helpful to you. If you have any other comments, again, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll try to respond to them. If you like the video, please leave a like. And if you like the channel and my videos, please subscribe to the channel so you can get notifications when I make new videos. And as always, thank you for watching my videos. I'll catch you next time.